Do you have advice on how a business owner could create an effective pitch when reaching out to these websites or these journalists? Is there like a strategy that you have in place?
Yeah, for sure. We have like a recipe for a pitch that we've seen the most success with. We do a lot of data tracking on our pitches as well. It's important to think when you're thinking about a pitch, there's three things to think about. First, who you're pitching. That's a really key piece because if you have the best pitch in the world, but you're hitting the wrong inbox, it doesn't matter. Nobody's going to read it. So you have to really think about targeting who is the right person to reach out to for that pitch. And that's not just going into Cision or going into Muck Rack and finding somebody in your relevant beat. It's really understanding what they write about, reading into their articles, understanding not just like the topics that they write about, but the way they write about them. And do they typically link back to websites? Do they include data sources? Is it more opinion pieces? Because opinion pieces are really just their opinion. They're probably not going to give you a backlink, but really understanding like the types of content that the journalist is writing. So that's the first piece, is having a good strategy of who you're reaching out to. The second piece of a good pitch is a good subject line. You can have the best pitch in the world in your body pitch, but if you don't have a good subject line, it's not going to get opened. So we've seen the best success with things that are either like statistics. So like 40% of people would rather give up their smartphone over their dog, or their dog over their smartphone was one that I pitched recently. Something that's like really eye-catching, buzzy, and going to get the journalist excited to open the email and like, hey, I want to know more about that. Or things that are like a question. So framing like, would you rather give up your dog or your smartphone? New survey finds out. Just something to like pique their interest and really stand out in their inbox. And then you can also always go with like, this new study shows XYZ, just something more straightforward. When you get into the actual pitch itself, we've found that straightforward, short, sweet pitches are the most effective. Journalists decide whether they're going to cover a story or decide whether they're going to keep reading a story in about like a few seconds. So that's how much time you have to capture their interest. You don't want to waste that time on like the fluff and the like, hi, how are you? This is what I do. This is what my client does. You want to get right into the meat of what the story is that you're pitching. So an interesting hook is great to start with, and then right away get into the data, get into the insights. If you have a cool graphic to share, that's great to include in your pitch. And then providing yourself as a resource. So saying like, happy to talk about this more on a call if that would be helpful to you, or happy to share the full data set with you if that's helpful, or something like that to give them some extra piece, and then signing it off. It doesn't have to be like a long pitch. Like I said, you only have a few seconds of their attention. So you really want to think about every word that goes into your pitch needs to add some sort of value and not just like to take up space.
So when you're doing this, you do the title that's very captivating. So now they've clicked in and you have a few bullet points of data. Do you say, hey, I think this would be cool for you to write about? Do you say, I want a link from you? Do you say, we've written a blog post, or we've had this that you could mention? Like, what is that question that you ask the journalist?
Yeah. So typically we'll create a landing page for our clients, and it's like everything all there on that landing page. It starts with like, this is the study, and then goes into like the statistics, and then it wraps up with a methodology. So everything that they would hypothetically need to write about should all of their questions should be answered in that landing page if they have further questions. Of course, we're always happy to like field the questions, but they shouldn't have to like go looking and go digging like, oh, when was this data collected? Oh, what survey platform did they use? How many people did they survey? Like all of that should be in one place, whether that's on a landing page, or like in a PDF package. Either is fine. We have found that landing pages is the most successful because then a client's more likely to link back to it. And then you don't really have to ask for a link because they're just going to cite their sources. That's like pretty much best practices in journalism. So it doesn't necessarily require that like awkward question of like, hey, can you give me a link? It's just like, hey, do you want to cover this? Or I thought this might be an interesting piece for your readers. Let me know how I can share more. But typically, if you have it in a landing page, they're going to link like 80 to 90% of the time. We do get those unlinked mentions, so dreaded unlinked mentions from time to time. And then we'll follow up with them if that's the case and say like, hey, we'd really like for you to, cite your sources. It'll provide your readers more context over the study and give them more details. But for the most part, they do naturally link back to the landing pages if you have it all in one place.
Is it better coming from a third party talking about it versus themselves? So like if I'm a chiropractor and I have this landing page that's beautiful and I answers all the questions you're talking about, and I reach out to this journalist and say, hey, look what I did, check this out, versus someone like you saying, hey, we have this client, or we found this awesome website that thought you might be interested in covering. Does it matter? Like if I guess what I'm trying to ask is, does it come off less or more humble if it comes from a third party versus like yourself?
I don't think it matters. I honestly think it adds a little bit of authority if it does come from like the chiropractor themselves. But at the same point, I think if it comes from like an agency or a PR professional, that person might have an established relationship with a journalist, and journalists are very used to working with agencies. They get agency pitches all the time. So I don't really think that it phases journalists one way or the other. I think it could add some credibility on either side for different reasons. But at the end of the day, the content itself is truly king.
So you brought up one thing I was going to ask about anyway, is a relationship. So I have two questions on this. One is, if I'm the chiropractor and I want to do this on my own, is there a tool or a place where I can reach out to, where I can go and say, give me all of the journalists in my local area? So one, that's the first question. So do I have access? Second, should I try to build relationships with them? And what does that look like? Is it just reaching out on LinkedIn? Is it just saying hi every once in a while? Like, how do I add value to them and build that relationship so that when we actually have a campaign, we've already established that?
For the first part, sourcing contacts, there's definitely a ton of tools. There's like Cision and Muckrack. They're pretty expensive and, come with that fee. So if that's not something that somebody's interested in, there's definitely other options. You can always it takes a lot of time, but you can always do some manual research into like your local station. So you can go into the Google News tab and search chiropractor and read through the stories that people are writing about chiropractors or about whatever topic that you're trying to pitch, and then go into those stories, look at the journalist that wrote the story, look at the rest of their stories, and then try to find their email. A lot of times the emails will be listed on like a broadcast news station's About Me or Contact Us page. Or a lot of times a helpful trick is like they'll have a pattern that all of their emails follow. So if you find one email and it's like first name dot last name at website.com, you can typically replicate that for pretty much any journalist. And that's usually successful. Sometimes you'll get a bounce, but there's no harm in trying. So there's different approaches if you don't want to pay for the tools. And honestly, the tools are really helpful for finding a lot of contacts in bulk, but sometimes the manual contacts are the ones that you'll see the best success with because they're not in the tools. So they're not getting thousands of pitches from thousands of PR people every single day. So sometimes it's beneficial to supplement your strategy regardless. You don't really have to have the tools. It's not like a end all be all for pitching contacts, in my opinion. The second question on relationship building, I think it's a common misconception that you like have to have an established relationship in order to secure coverage from sites. At the end of the day, if you have good content, they're going to defer to that. They're looking for things to write about. So it's just a matter of breaking through in their inbox. I definitely think journalists favor people that they've worked with in the past. If they have established relationships, if they're like, they see a pitch from Kalina and they've worked with me several times, they might be more likely to open it. Like that's definitely true. But I don't think that means that it's impossible to get coverage without having a pre-established relationship. I've found that journalists are like, they don't often respond to emails. They're very busy and they get a ton of pitches. So relationship building can be really hard. And I found the most success in relationship building through actually like working on projects and providing them resources. And they're like, they cover one thing and they're like, hey, this was really great. I'd love to work with you again. Please put me on your list. Send me the next thing you're working on. So I've found that relationship building kind of happens throughout the process and then it gets easier over time. But just diving in head first and starting and focusing on good content and providing them something that's going to be valuable to their audience and not just valuable to you is probably the best way to start with relationship building.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click here. If you want to watch the entire podcast, click here.